On the southern coast of England, tucked between a crescent of wind-swept cliffs and a harbour busy only in the summer months, lay the quiet village of Seabridge Haven. It was the sort of place where the sea air tasted faintly of salt and gossip, where fishermen knew every pebble on the shore, and where nothing, truly nothing, ever happened. Or so the villagers insisted whenever an outsider remarked upon the loneliness of the coast. On this particular Thursday afternoon, however, the village thrummed with an unusual excitement. The annual harbour flower show was underway, complete with tea tents, an amateur brass band, and more rose varieties than Miss Marple had ever seen in one place. Invited by her old friend, Mrs. Clara Whitcomb, Miss Marple had made the journey from St. Mary Mead to Seabridge Haven for a short holiday. A little seaside air, Clara had promised, and absolutely no unpleasantness. Miss Marple had smiled politely. She never believed in no unpleasantness. The flower show was held near the pier, where the last ferry of the day would soon arrive from Gull's Point Island, a tiny isle half a mile away, home to only 6 residents and one famously dilapidated manor house. As the final ferry drew near, its motor humming steadily across the water, many villagers paused their flower judging or cake sampling to glance toward the pier. The arrival of the ferry always carried a touch of ceremony. After all, it brought with it the day's island visitors, and sometimes the island's troubles. Miss Marple stood with Clara near a display of dahlias, her keen blue eyes drifting toward the waves. "My dear Jane," Clara said, fussing with her gloves, "I do hope you're enjoying yourself. No mysteries here, I assure you." She gave a nervous laugh, the kind one gives when making a promise one hopes is true. "Oh, my dear Clara," Miss Marple answered gently, "mysteries are like weeds in a garden. They appear whether one wants them to or not." Before Clara could ask what she meant, a shrill whistle sounded from the pier. The ferry had docked. A small cluster of passengers stepped onto the wooden planks. 2 tourists with cameras, an elderly fisherman carrying crates of supplies, and Mr. Leonard Pike, the island's caretaker, and a man known for both his punctuality and peculiar temperament. But today, Leonard Pike did not look merely peculiar. He looked ashen. He stumbled forward, gripping the ferry railing. The captain, a stout man with whiskers like damp rope, hurried after him. "Are you all right, Mr. Pike?" someone called. But Leonard Pike didn't answer. His eyes darted wildly toward the villagers, then toward the ferry, then back again as though something or someone had followed him. Miss Marple watched closely. Fear, she noted, was not a common expression worn by Leonard Pike. He was more often seen grumbling about broken nets or muttering darkly about mainland folk who didn't understand island ways. But fear, true fear, was unmistakable. "Help! Someone fetch the constable!" he rasped. Constable Greenway, who had been happily sampling a Victoria sponge near the refreshment tent, looked up, startled. "What seems to be the matter, Mr. Pike?" he asked, approaching with crumbs clinging to his uniform. Pike opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He swayed. Miss Marple stepped forward instinctively, though several younger villagers reached him first. Then, in a voice strained and trembling, Pike whispered, He's dead. Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne, on the island, dead in the study. It's not natural. It can't be." A gasp rippled across the pier. Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne, the wealthy, imperious owner of Gull's Point Manor, known for both generosity and quarrels in equal measure, was not a man easily imagined dead. He was vigorous for his age, proud, and not above dictating to the villagers how things ought to be done. "Dead?" Constable Greenway repeated uncertainly. "Natural causes, perhaps?" "No," Leonard Pike breathed. "It was murder." The words struck the air like a cold wave. Panic began to buzz through the crowd. Mothers pulled children closer. Men whispered theories under their breath. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained perfectly still, her gaze drifting toward the waiting ferry and then toward the distant silhouette of the island, dark against the setting sun. For in Leonard Pike's posture, in the way he clutched his cap with trembling fingers, in the darting of his eyes as if expecting pursuit, Miss Marple had noticed something crucial. Something others, in their excitement, had not seen. Whatever had happened at Gull's Point Island, it had frightened Leonard Pike before he ever left the shore. And fright of that sort rarely sprang from the dead. It came from the living. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "I think, Clara dear," she said softly, "that your village is about to have its share of unpleasantness after all." Miss Marple's quiet observation of Leonard Pike did not go unnoticed by Clara, who clutched her arm in a sudden flutter of nerves. The commotion on the pier had shattered the cheerful atmosphere of the flower show. Conversations dimmed, the brass band faltered, and even the sea breeze seemed to hush itself. Miss Marple, however, looked as composed as if someone had merely misplaced a teacup rather than announced a murder. Her calmness was precisely why Clara leaned so heavily upon her at moments like these. Constable Greenway cleared his throat, mustering as much authority as his round figure and flustered expression allowed. "Everyone, please, go about your business. Mr. Pike is clearly distressed. I'll take statements." His tone was earnest but unconvincing, and Miss Marple suspected that even he did not believe his own reassurance. A murder, especially on the island Guaul, could not be so easily smoothed over. Leonard Pike, still trembling, sank onto a wooden bench by the pier. Someone fetched him a cup of tea, which he held but did not drink. Miss Marple approached him gently, moving with that soft-footed grace that made her blend into a scene rather than interrupt it. "Mr. Pike," she said, her voice low, "you must have had a dreadful shock." He swallowed hard and nodded. His eyes were fixed on a distant point, as though he were seeing the island still. What exactly happened?" Clara asked timidly from behind Miss Marple. Pike's breathing grew uneven. "I went to the manor early this morning, same as always. Sir Geoffrey expected me at 9 sharp. Found the main door open. Odd, that was. Sir Geoffrey never left doors open. He was particular." Pike rubbed his forehead, smearing salt and sweat. "I called out. No answer. Walked through the hall. Then I saw him. In the study. Slumped over the writing desk." Miss Marple noticed how he avoided meeting the constable's gaze, yet he did not shy from hers. Experience had taught her that frightened people often confided in those who seemed least threatening, and she, by all accounts, was entirely unthreatening. "Was there anyone else on the island this morning?" she asked calmly. Pike hesitated. "Yes, at least, there should have been." He shifted uneasily. "Miss Eleanor Hawthorne arrived yesterday, Sir Geoffrey's niece, sharp-tongued sort. And there was Mr. Lionel Havers, the solicitor. Came about the estate. Sir Geoffrey had been making changes to his will, I heard." "And did you see either of them?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Pike whispered. "Not a soul. That's what frightened me. The manor was too quiet. Not even the usual creaking or the wireless playing. Just that silence." His fingers tightened around the teacup. "And something else. Something I can't quite put right." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Yes?" Pike looked at her with a haunted expression. The window in the study was wide open, but the latch, Sir Geoffrey always locked it, always, and there were footprints on the sill, muddy, fresh, like someone left in a hurry. Or watched him." Clara gasped softly. Constable Greenway scribbled nervously in his notebook, though Miss Marple suspected half the details would be lost in his fluster. "Mr. Pike," she said, "forgive me, but did you go near the body?" He shook his head violently. "No, ma'am. I stepped in, took one look, and ran straight to the ferry. I didn't touch a thing." That was interesting. Very interesting. Miss Marple had already noticed the faint streak of oil on Pike's sleeve. A smear she doubted came from merely stepping into a study. But she said nothing. Not yet. The constable at last gathered enough resolve to say, "I'll take the next ferry over. Mr. Pike, you'll accompany me. Anyone else who has business on the island, please stay available for questioning." He puffed out his chest as though this declaration made him look authoritative. Miss Marple suspected it did not. "Jane," Clara whispered, tugging her sleeve, "you are not thinking of going over there, are you?" "Oh, but I am," Miss Marple replied gently. "When a terrible thing happens, it is only right to understand it, especially when frightened men tell us only half of what they truly know." Clara blanched. "You think Leonard is hiding something?" "My dear Clara," Miss Marple said, folding her hands, "almost everyone hides something. The trick is to see when their secrets do not fit the shape of their story." The constable began ushering Leonard Pike toward the ferry, the sun dipping low behind them, casting long shadows across the water. Miss Marple stepped forward too, her mind already arranging the pieces of what little she had heard, noting the gaps, the hesitations, the curious fear. A murder on a quiet island. A dead man drafting a new will. A niece with a temper. A solicitor with vested interests and footprints on a sill. But most telling of all, the way Leonard Pike clutched his sleeve, as though afraid someone might look too closely. As the last ferry rocked gently against the pier, Miss Marple boarded with a soft sigh. She had not come to Seabridge Haven seeking a mystery. But mysteries, she reflected, had a tiresome habit of seeking her. The ferry cut through the waters with a rhythmic churn of its propellers, leaving a trail of white foam behind. Miss Marple stood near the railing, steadying herself against the mild rocking of the boat, and watched Seabridge Haven shrink into a misty haze. Leonard Pike sat stiffly on a bench, hands clasped over his knees, muttering to himself in nervous fragments. Constable Greenway hovered nearby, glancing at the island through narrowed eyes as if sheer willpower could make the truth appear. The journey, though brief, was enough for Miss Marple to observe the island from a distance. Gull's Point Manor, perched on the far edge, seemed almost to frown down at the harbor. Its tall windows reflected the sun, and the gardens sloped carelessly toward the cliffs, overgrown in places where pride or neglect had let them wander. A faint curl of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was home, or at least moving about inside. "Mr. Pike," Miss Marple said softly, drawing his attention, "did anyone else have access to the study yesterday or today?" Pike shook his head. "No, ma'am. Only Sir Geoffrey and me. Except Miss Eleanor. She likes to peek into the rooms, but she never touches anything important." His voice trailed off, and he cast a furtive glance at the constable, who was busy consulting a notebook that seemed more decorative than useful. Miss Marple noted the pause. It was a subtle hesitation, the sort that spoke more than words. Someone, perhaps Leonard himself, knew more than he admitted, but she let him speak no further. Sometimes silence drew out truths more efficiently than questions. As the ferry approached the jetty, the wind carried the faint tang of salt and something else, an earthy odor, sharp and unfamiliar. Miss Marple's experience told her that smells, much like small behaviors, could betray what a person hoped to hide. She tucked the observation away for later. Upon landing, the group made their way up the gravel path toward the manor. The front door, just as Pike had said, stood slightly ajar, though no one had touched the brass knocker or handled the latch. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the neat footprints in the soft gravel, noting their direction, depth, and spacing. There was little about them to suggest haste, but enough to indicate careful avoidance of detection. Inside, the manor smelled of polished wood, damp books, and a faint hint of cigars. The grand hall stretched before them, and at the end, the study door loomed, closed. Leonard Pike's hand trembled as he reached for it, then faltered. The constable, seeing this, pushed past him with a sort of officious vigor. "I should check the scene first," Greenway declared, but his voice wavered despite his confidence. Miss Marple waited a moment, letting the others go ahead. She knew the danger of rushing in. People who panic often leave more clues than they realize. When the constable flung open the study door, the room seemed almost undisturbed. Heavy drapes hung in neat folds, papers were stacked in small piles, and the desk bore the faint marks of ink. But at the far corner, Miss Marple caught the glint of something unusual. A small chair turned slightly, out of place, and a sheet of paper crumpled at its base. Leonard Pike's voice broke as he pointed shakily toward the desk. He was there. Sir Geoffrey, slumped forward, dead. Miss Marple's gaze traveled over the desk. The handwriting on the crumpled sheet was jagged, as though written in haste or panic. She could almost feel the tension of the writer's hand. More intriguingly, the paper was on top of a faint layer of dust, disturbed in a very deliberate arc. "Curious," she murmured, under her breath. Her eyes then swept to the window. The latch was indeed broken, as Pike had said, and a faint smear along the sill suggested someone had gripped it, or perhaps leaned against it. She noted the direction, from inside to outside. Whoever had entered or exited this way had not gone unnoticed by the careful Mr. Pike. The constable frowned. "There's nothing here indicating foul play. Perhaps he fell." Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her expression was unreadable. "People do not generally fall forward into their desks, Constable, nor leave their windows unlocked while they do. Accidents rarely involve haste and anxiety, and this study carries both." Pike's hand flew to his mouth. I didn't touch anything, I swear. I just found him." Miss Marple nodded kindly, her eyes not leaving the traces on the windowsill. "Of course. That is why you are valuable to us, Mr. Pike. You saw what others did not." The sunlight was fading as she stepped closer to the desk, noting the slight smudge of ink on the armrest and the disturbance of papers. Subtle things, easily overlooked, but speaking volumes to someone who paid attention. And Miss Marple paid attention, always. In that quiet room, smelling of old wood and secrets, she understood something crucial. The clues to Sir Geoffrey's death were not violent or dramatic. They were hidden in hesitation, in small misplacements, and in the fear that had brought Leonard Pike trembling across the water. The story had begun, and Miss Marple's mind was already assembling the pieces with a patience only time could temper. Miss Marple lingered near the study doorway, letting Constable Greenway and Leonard Pike move about the room under the guise of investigation. She had learned long ago that those who claimed to be searching often overlooked the smallest, most telling details. And it was precisely in such oversights that the truth waited. Her eyes traced the faint scuff marks on the polished floorboards, the subtle shift of a chair leg, and the pattern of dust disturbed across the room. Each indicated a movement, a hesitation, a choice, a story in itself. Leonard Pike's agitation was mounting. He kept glancing at the study window as if expecting the culprit to reappear. "I don't understand," he muttered, his voice low and trembling. "Who would do this? Sir Geoffrey had friends. People respected him. Mostly." He let the thought trail off, and Miss Marple noted the careful vagueness. Respect, she thought, rarely deterred a murderer. "Did anyone visit yesterday?" she asked softly, stepping closer to Pike. "You mentioned Miss Eleanor Hawthorne and Mr. Lionel Havers, but were there others? Any tradesmen, neighbors?" Pike shook his head, but the motion was not entirely convincing. "No. Only the usual deliveries. The milk, the bread, and... yes, a package. It arrived late in the morning." "A package?" Miss Marple prompted. "Yes, I didn't touch it. Sir Geoffrey usually opened his parcels himself. It was from London, I think. The label said... well, I didn't read it properly." Pike's voice faltered. Miss Marple made a mental note. Packages arriving unexpectedly often contained more than their outward appearance suggested. Money, documents, threats. She filed it quietly, reserving her questions for later. Constable Greenway moved toward the fireplace, mumbling about fingerprints and natural causes, but Miss Marple had little interest in his fumbling. Her gaze fell upon a small, ornate box on a side table. It had been slightly nudged, as though someone had deliberately moved it aside. She bent and examined it carefully. Inside, she found a few letters, each written in the careful, deliberate hand of Sir Geoffrey. Yet one, tucked beneath the others, was hastily scrawled and addressed to a dear friend, its tone anxious, even fearful. Her fingers paused over the paper. Someone had disturbed Sir Geoffrey's usual, meticulous order, and in the process left a subtle trail. Miss Marple always found such trails spoke louder than loud voices or clumsy alarms. "Constable," she said softly, Might I see the list of who was expected at Gull's Point today? Any appointments, deliveries, or visitors? Greenway shuffled papers and produced a notebook, his handwriting less precise than usual. As he read aloud, Miss Marple noted every omission, every hesitation, and every emphasis he made. Only a few names appeared. Miss Eleanor, the solicitor, Meton, Havers, and the usual caretaker, Leonard Pike. Yet the anxious tone of the letters suggested Sir Geoffrey had been expecting someone else, someone whose name did not appear on any official list. Miss Marple stepped to the window. The latch was indeed broken, confirming Pike's story. But the slight smear along the sill was not from Leonard's hands. It was narrower, delicate, as if the person who had leaned there was smaller, lighter. A clue, almost imperceptible, but it could suggest either a deliberate attempt to enter unnoticed or an impulsive escape. A sudden sound made her turn, a low creak from the upper hallway. She straightened instantly, her blue eyes sharp. "Leonard," she said calmly, "you stay here. Constable Greenway, please investigate. I will check upstairs briefly." The landing was quiet, almost eerily so, but Miss Marple's trained eyes noted the faint indentations in the carpet leading towards Sir Geoffrey's private sitting room. A chair had been pulled back, a drawer left slightly open, and a silver pen holder tilted just enough to catch the light. Each detail was minor, but together they painted a scene of hurried disturbance. Descending, she rejoined the others, her mind weaving the observations into a coherent pattern. "Sir Geoffrey's study," she said gently, "shows signs of recent agitation." He did not anticipate the presence of the person who arrived. Something urgent brought this visitor, and it did not end well. Leonard Pike's gaze met hers, wide and fearful. Miss Marple noted the tiny tremor in his lips, the subtle shift of his posture. He was scared, yes, but he was not lying about what he had seen. The tension of someone hiding their own secret hovered around him like a shadow. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the study's shadows grew long and sharp. Miss Marple stood near the desk once more, her eyes sweeping the room. Every minor detail, the disturbed letters, the scuffed floorboards, the narrow smear on the window, spoke to her of deliberate movement, careful concealment, and the presence of a mind trained to avoid detection. Whoever had killed Sir Geoffrey had planned carefully, yet left the smallest breadcrumbs. And she, as always, had already begun to notice them. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer in the study, letting her gaze travel over every object as though each held a story. The silver inkwell, the carefully stacked correspondence, the tiny dent on the corner of the desk, all spoke of Sir Geoffrey's habitual precision. Yet here, amid the meticulousness, something was subtly askew. Pattern, small and quiet, that only someone who truly observed could discern. "Leonard," she said softly, turning to the caretaker, "did Sir Geoffrey receive any visitors yesterday evening?" Pike swallowed hard, his knuckles whitening around the cup of tea he had been clutching. "No, I don't believe so, Miss Marple. He usually dined alone. Though Miss Eleanor did come by, as usual, for tea. And Mr. Havers called, but that was in the afternoon." Miss Marple nodded, already piecing together the timeline. Afternoon calls, evening solitude, a morning discovery. It fit a narrow window in which someone could have visited unobserved. She glanced toward the window again, noting the broken latch and the faint smear on the sill. Whoever had used it had left deliberately little evidence. Yet Miss Marple had already identified the subtle imprint of a hand, light and precise. The constable, meanwhile, had begun examining the desk drawers, muttering about fingerprints and the lack of forced entry. Miss Marple knew Greenway was good-natured but limited in his methods. He looked for obvious evidence, whereas the truth often hid in subtler forms. She had learned long ago that the most meticulous criminals left traces that spoke to those willing to observe human behavior. Walking around the desk, she picked up the crumpled letter Pike had pointed out earlier. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, unlike Sir Geoffrey's usual careful script. Whoever had written it had been anxious, perhaps even fearful. The words themselves were vague, a plea for understanding, a promise of discretion, and a cryptic mention of the matter that must be resolved before dawn. Miss Marple felt a faint shiver. Anxiety and urgency rarely coincided without reason. "Did you see the letter before?" she asked Pike. He shook his head, gaze fixed on the floor. "No, I didn't. I swear, Miss Marple." She folded the paper carefully, her mind turning over possibilities. A visitor, a letter, a broken window latch, and a dead man who had been unusually tense in the days leading to his death. Miss Marple felt the familiar pull of a puzzle that had yet to reveal its full picture. The study's atmosphere was heavy with the scent of old wood and faint cigar smoke. Outside, the wind carried the distant cries of seabirds and the low lapping of waves against the shore. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the small footprints in the dust near the window and on the slightly ajar drawer. She studied them, noting the angle of the prints, the spacing, the depth. Each detail was a sentence in a story that was still incomplete. "Constable," she said, drawing him close with a gentle touch on the arm. "May I suggest you speak with anyone who might have delivered parcels yesterday? Even seemingly insignificant visitors can provide insight. And, Leonard, you may want to recount the sequence of your morning again, slowly, from the moment you entered the study." Pike nodded, though his hands continued to shake. Greenway scowled, but agreed to follow her advice, evidently trusting her judgment more than he cared to admit. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the portrait above the fireplace. A stern-looking Sir Geoffrey, framed in gilded oak, staring down as if disapproving of the disorder below. She allowed herself a small, inward smile. Human nature, she thought, never changed, whether in painted likeness or living form. The subtle motions, the hesitation, the fear, the careful concealment, they all spoke, if only one knew how to listen. She turned back to the study, noting the faint scuff marks on the floor leading from the doorway to the desk. Someone had moved quickly, yet deliberately, avoiding unnecessary disturbance. And in the dust near the fireplace, there was a faint impression of something small, perhaps a glove, perhaps a hand, left behind in the rush. The room was quiet again, except for Pike's occasional muttering and the distant wind. Miss Marple's mind began weaving threads together, forming connections between the letters, the visitors, the footprints, and the broken latch. One thing was certain: the murderer had not acted without thought. Every movement was calculated, every action deliberate, yet the tiniest detail, a smudge, a misplaced letter, a hastily turned chair, would betray them to a careful observer. Miss Marple stepped back from the desk and folded her hands. The pieces were all here, scattered like petals from a storm. The question now was not what had happened, but who had been clever enough to conceal their hand, while leaving just enough behind for someone perceptive to see. She allowed herself a quiet moment, letting the tension of the room settle, knowing that the answers would soon reveal themselves to one patient enough to notice the whispers of human behavior. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to observe Leonard Pike as he recounted in halting detail the events of the morning. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his coat, and his eyes constantly flicked toward the study window, as though expecting to see the very shadow of the murderer slipping through. She noticed how he lingered over certain words, emphasizing them without realizing it, betraying the moments that had frightened him most. A careful listener could read his fear like a map, and Miss Marple was always a careful listener. "Sir Geoffrey," Pike said, voice trembling. He was at the desk when I arrived. I called out, but he didn't answer. I stepped closer and then I saw him leaning forward, slumped. At first, I thought he'd merely dozed off, but..." His throat tightened and he faltered. The words stuck. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "But you realized it was more than sleep." Yes, Pike whispered. "And the window, it was open. I don't know how it happened. I know Sir Geoffrey never left it unlocked." He shivered. "And there were prints, muddy, fresh. I didn't see anyone, but I felt I was being watched." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the careful vagueness. The fear in Pike's voice was genuine, but she suspected he had unconsciously omitted a detail. People often did, especially when their instinct for caution outweighed their desire to tell the whole truth. "Leonard," she said softly, "think back. Did you notice anything unusual in the study before you found Sir Geoffrey? Anything at all? A sound, a smell, a misplaced object?" Pike frowned. He chewed the inside of his cheek. There was something. I thought it was nothing, but the letters. One was out of place. Not the usual neatness. It was crumpled, like he had been startled or writing quickly. Miss Marple's mind leapt quietly. The jagged letter, the hurried scrawl, the anxious tone. It suggested more than mere accident. Someone had arrived unexpectedly, someone whose presence Sir Geoffrey had not anticipated. And this presence had provoked fear, not argument. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, was far more revealing than anger. Constable Greenway moved about, lifting papers and mumbling, "No forced entry, no struggle, must have been natural causes." His tone lacked conviction, and his gaze flicked repeatedly toward Pike, betraying a subtle doubt. Miss Marple, however, had already discarded the idea of a simple accident. The broken window latch, the disturbed letters, the delicate smear on the sill, all were evidence of deliberate movement. She walked slowly to the desk, noticing the slight indentation in the wood where Sir Geoffrey's arm had rested. It was a position consistent with writing, yet the crumpled letter suggested he had been interrupted. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint streak of ink on the corner of the desk. Not large enough to mark a fall, but enough to suggest tension and haste. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the cries of gulls and the faint smell of the sea. The manor, usually serene, seemed charged with unease. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the faint pattern of footprints in the dust near the window. Delicate and narrow, almost as though the visitor had tried to move lightly, avoiding notice. Whoever had been here had intended to remain unseen, yet their actions left a whisper of evidence for those paying attention. "Constable," she said quietly, "you might wish to speak with anyone who could have delivered a package yesterday, or anyone whose arrival might have been unexpected. And Leonard, I would ask you to recount once more the sequence of your own movements this morning, paying particular attention to each door you opened, each step you took." Pike nodded, still pale, while Greenway scowled but reluctantly complied. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room once more. The tilted chair, the disordered letters, the slight smudge on the window, and she felt the familiar thrill of the puzzle forming in her mind. Every small detail mattered, every hesitation, every subtle sign of fear or haste was a clue. As she stood by the window, looking out at the darkening horizon, she considered the possibilities. A visitor, a hurried note, a broken latch, and footprints too careful to belong to an ordinary intruder. One thing was clear. The murderer had been deliberate, cautious, and clever. Yet cleverness often left traces, and Miss Marple had long known that human nature, when frightened or hurried, rarely concealed its secrets entirely. Her mind began assembling the pieces quietly, patiently, aware that the smallest observation could illuminate the entire chain of events. The night was falling, and with it the tension in Gull's Point Manor thickened. Miss Marple folded her hands, her eyes returning to the subtle clues around the study, certain that the truth would reveal itself if observed with care and patience. Miss Marple allowed the quiet of the study to settle around her, listening to the faint creak of the manor settling and the distant lap of waves against the cliffs. Leonard Pike had been sent to fetch a lantern for the attic, and Constable Greenway was poring over the letters once more, muttering under his breath about signatures and handwriting. Left alone for a few moments, she moved carefully through the room, noting again the subtle irregularities that spoke louder than any hurried words. The crumpled letter remained on the desk, its jagged edges a stark contrast to Sir Geoffrey's usual meticulous correspondence. Miss Marple lifted it gently, smoothing it against the polished wood, and studied the hurried penmanship. There was fear here, certainly, but also urgency. an insistence that something be resolved before the day's end. Who had written it? And had Sir Geoffrey finished reading it before the fatal moment? Her gaze drifted to the window. The broken latch had been pivotal in Leonard Pike's story, yet the smear along the sill told a second story entirely. Narrow, delicate, deliberate. Someone smaller, lighter than Pike had passed through. Someone practiced in quiet movement. Miss Marple frowned slightly. She could feel the story forming around that single detail, but it was incomplete. A sudden movement caught her attention. The fireplace. There, partially hidden behind the hearth screen, was a small scrap of paper, yellowed and folded once. Picking it up carefully, she unfolded it. It was a note, brief and cryptic. "Meet me tonight. Do not tell anyone. It is urgent." The handwriting was not Sir Geoffrey's. The note had been hidden with care, yet the paper's faint creases betrayed hurried handling. Someone had been meeting him in secret. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, weaving the detail into the earlier observations. The crumpled letter, the broken latch, the footprints in the dust. She realized that Sir Geoffrey's death had not been spontaneous. It was the result of an intrusion that had forced a confrontation, one carefully orchestrated and yet imperfectly executed. Constable Greenway's voice broke the moment, drawing her attention. "Miss Marple, look at this." He held up a small envelope from the desk drawer. The seal was broken, and inside lay a few pages of notes detailing the estate, recent financial transactions, and, most interestingly, a will draft different from the previous version. The changes were subtle but significant. Legacies redirected, specific clauses emphasizing discretion. Miss Marple's eyes twitched slightly. She had long suspected that disputes over inheritance often bred more than polite argument. "Do you think someone knew about this?" Greenway asked. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, "and they acted upon that knowledge." She glanced toward the footprints again, toward the broken latch, and then back at Leonard Pike, who hovered nervously near the doorway. And someone knew just enough to strike fear into Mr. Pike, ensuring he would not intervene. At that moment, a faint sound from the hallway, footsteps, soft and deliberate, made them all turn. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Whoever it was moved carefully, almost deliberately letting their presence be felt without drawing immediate attention. A subtle psychological maneuver, she realized, to intimidate rather than engage. "Stay here," she murmured, moving toward the hallway, her steps light, almost whispering against the carpet. The corridor stretched before her, lined with portraits and doors slightly ajar. Each door held the potential for a secret, each shadow a hint of someone hiding more than they admitted. Reaching the sitting room, she paused, noting a faint smell of perfume lingering in the air, a strong floral note that did not belong to the manor. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Someone had been here recently. Someone with reason to conceal their presence, and that presence might hold the key to understanding why Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne lay dead in his study. Returning to the study, she quietly directed Greenway and Pike to recount once more the sequence of the morning, but this time in precise, deliberate detail. She listened for inconsistencies, for hesitation, for that subtle language of fear and secrecy. Each tiny inflection, each pause, each small gesture could reveal far more than words alone. The sun had long disappeared behind the cliffs, leaving the manor bathed in twilight. Shadows deepened in corners, and the wind whispered against the window panes. Miss Marple folded her hands and let her mind connect the threads. An unexpected visitor, a secret meeting, hurried correspondence, broken window latch, delicate footprints, and notes regarding changes to the will. Somewhere in this web of fear, secrecy, and urgency lay the truth, and Miss Marple, patient and observant as ever, could feel that truth slowly revealing its shape. Miss Marple sat quietly in the study, letting the fading light from the high windows illuminate the small details that others might easily overlook. Leonard Pike, still pale and twitchy, hovered near the doorway, glancing constantly at the corners of the room, as if expecting the shadows themselves to betray a secret. Constable Greenway, notebook in hand, shuffled papers, but seemed increasingly aware that he was not in command here. Miss Marple, however, had no need for command. Observation alone sufficed. "Leonard," she said gently, "think carefully. When you discovered Sir Geoffrey, did you notice anything unusual about the desk? Anything that seemed out of place, or any papers moved?" Pike hesitated, fingers tightening around his coat lapel. Yes, ma'am. There was a ledger, I think. Not open like usual. The pages had been turned hastily, I think, and there was a pen on the floor. I didn't pick it up." Miss Marple nodded slowly, storing the detail. A pen on the floor might be inconsequential, or it might indicate a struggle, a hurried note, or an attempt to finish a thought interrupted by fear. Every small item mattered, especially when paired with other subtle irregularities. "Did you hear anything unusual this morning?" she asked. "Any footsteps, doors opening, voices? Anything at all?" Pike shook his head vigorously. "No, ma'am. I swear it was quiet. Too quiet. And then I thought I heard something. A creak, maybe, from upstairs. I didn't investigate. He trailed off, swallowing hard. Miss Marple made a note. Hesitation like that was revealing. Fear often caused people to omit the very details that might explain what happened. She was beginning to see a pattern. Sir Geoffrey's morning had been disrupted by someone he had not anticipated. That person had moved carefully, deliberately, and yet left just enough evidence to be traced by a perceptive observer. Her gaze drifted to the window. The broken latch remained an important clue. The narrow smear of dirt along the sill suggested someone lighter than Pike had entered or exited that way. The footprints in the dust confirmed the same. Careful, measured, deliberate. Whoever had used the window had intended to leave little evidence, yet in their caution they had revealed themselves to someone paying attention. Greenway, glancing up from his notes, muttered, "I suppose it could have been anyone. Visitors, neighbors, even the staff." His voice trailed off, betraying his uncertainty. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, Constable, it could be anyone. But consider this. Someone had precise knowledge of Sir Geoffrey's habits, and someone acted upon it. The broken window, the hastily crumpled letter, the narrow footprints, they speak of a deliberate intrusion, not a random event." Pike shifted uncomfortably. I didn't see anyone, Miss Marple. I swear. Only when I left, I felt watched, as if someone was still there, hiding. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the tiniest tremor of his hands and the barely perceptible glance toward the corner of the room. "Yes," she murmured softly. "Fear can make shadows seem larger than they are, but it can also reveal truths. And your fear, Leonard, is genuine. You are not lying. You merely did not realize what you had seen." A sudden noise from the hallway made all three turn, soft, deliberate footsteps moving away from the study, fading into the distance. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. The intruder might still be within the manor, testing the nerves of those present, or it could have been someone leaving a subtle warning. Either way, it was a psychological maneuver, an attempt to unsettle, to create doubt. She moved closer to the desk, examining the crumpled letter and the hastily turned pages once more. The contents suggested anxiety, urgency, and secrecy. Someone had arrived unexpectedly, and Sir Geoffrey's death had been the result of a confrontation provoked by that arrival. The question now was, who had that motive, and who had the means to act with such care? Miss Marple turned to Leonard Pike. "You will stay close to the main room. Constable, continue your examination, but do not disturb anything unnecessarily. And remember, the smallest detail, an ink smudge, a footprint, a note left carelessly, can reveal the truth." The light in the room dimmed as the evening deepened, casting long shadows across the floor. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting the letters, the broken latch, the footprints, and the intruder's subtle maneuvers. Somewhere in these small, careful movements lay the key to the puzzle, and Miss Marple, patient and observant, already felt the first threads of understanding beginning to align. The manor had grown still as the evening deepened, yet Miss Marple's mind remained alert, piecing together the subtleties she had observed since arriving. Leonard Pike's anxiety had not abated. He sat near the doorway, hands clasped tightly, eyes flicking repeatedly to the study window. Miss Marple, in her usual quiet manner, let him stew in his own fear, knowing it would reveal nuances that words often could not. "Constable," she said softly, breaking the silence, "you mentioned the ledger on the desk. Have you noted all the entries, and have you observed if anything was out of the ordinary?" Greenway shuffled his papers, frowning. "Most of it seems routine, Miss Marple. Financial records, inventories. Though there is a note here suggesting a change to the will. I didn't think it was significant." Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. Everything was significant if viewed in context. She leaned closer to examine the ledger herself, noting the careful corrections in pencil and the hurried scribbles in ink. These small alterations were more than clerical errors. They spoke of anxiety and anticipation, a desire to record something important before time ran out. Leonard Pike swallowed audibly. "Sir Geoffrey. He was worried about something. I heard him muttering to himself. Late last night, I mean. Something about ensuring everything was in order. I didn't think much at the time." Miss Marple nodded slowly, allowing the statement to settle. Fear, caution, secrecy. These were threads that, when woven together, revealed far more than direct statements ever could. Someone had come to the manor unexpectedly, someone who knew of these anxieties and had exploited them. Her attention returned to the window. The broken latch remained an enigma, a focal point for her deductions. The narrow smear of dirt, the faint footprints in the dust, the careful avoidance of disturbances, they all indicated a visitor both light and deliberate. Someone accustomed to moving silently and leaving as little evidence as possible. "Leonard," she asked gently, "when you approached the window this morning, did you notice anything unusual outside? Any footprints, any marks, or disturbances in the gravel?" Pike nodded, voice low. "Yes. There were footprints leading away from the sill, not deep, not hurried, just deliberate, I suppose. Someone left quietly. I couldn't see who, and I didn't think to follow. I was too frightened." Miss Marple made a mental note. Careful, controlled movement suggested both experience and intention. This was not a crime of passion. It was a carefully planned act, executed with precision, yet flawed in its overconfidence. She then turned her attention to the letters again, examining the hastily scrawled note and the crumpled correspondence beneath it. The tone of fear was unmistakable, yet there was a hint of anticipation, as if the writer had expected a resolution, a confrontation, or perhaps a secret meeting. The pieces were aligning, yet one essential element remained unclear: who had arrived and why. The wind outside shifted, carrying a faint floral scent into the study. Miss Marple's eyes twitched. She had noticed the same aroma faintly earlier in the sitting room. Someone with a deliberate presence had been in the manor, leaving not only physical traces but subtle sensory hints of their passing. "Constable," she said softly, "you will need to question Miss Eleanor Hawthorne and Mr. Lionel Havers first thing in the morning. And Leonard, please recount once again the timeline of your morning. Every action, every pause, every door you opened. Even the smallest detail could prove crucial." Pike nodded, paler than before, while Greenway scowled but dutifully made notes. Miss Marple allowed herself a small inward smile. Human nature rarely concealed its truths entirely. It simply required patience and careful observation. The last light of day faded entirely, leaving the study bathed in shadows. Miss Marple folded her hands and let her thoughts drift over the evidence. The broken latch, the footprints, the letters, the hastily altered ledger, and the intruder's subtle, psychological maneuvers. Somewhere within these traces lay the key to Sir Geoffrey's death. The pieces were forming, slowly, like a pattern emerging from a tapestry of secrets, and Miss Marple, as ever, would wait patiently for the final thread to reveal the whole picture. The night had fully settled over Gull's Point Manor, and the shadows in the study seemed to stretch longer, filling the corners with silent reminders of secrets yet uncovered. Miss Marple stood near the desk, her eyes tracing the faint smudges of ink and the scuffs on the floor, while Leonard Pike remained by the doorway, pale and tense. Constable Greenway had retreated to examine the ledger by lamplight, muttering occasionally about clerical irregularities. Yet Miss Marple knew that the truth was not to be found in mere paperwork. It lay in human behavior, the subtleties that went unnoticed by most. "Leonard," she said gently, "you mentioned hearing something upstairs this morning. Can you recall the sound more clearly? Even the smallest detail could help us understand what happened." Pike's hands trembled as he clasped them together. "It was a creak, slow, deliberate, like someone stepping carefully on the stairs. I thought I imagined it at first, but then I heard a slight rustle, like fabric brushing against wood. I froze. I didn't move. I just wanted to leave him be." Miss Marple nodded slowly, letting the information settle. The creak, the rustle of fabric, these were subtle signs of movement. Someone had been careful, someone accustomed to avoiding detection, yet they had left evidence for those patient enough to notice. Her eyes drifted to the desk once more, where the crumpled letter and the hastily turned pages lay. Anxiety and urgency radiated from the scrawled note, yet it also hinted at anticipation, a desire for resolution. Whoever had written it had intended to meet someone, or perhaps to confront a matter that could no longer be postponed. Greenway, peering over his spectacles at the ledger, muttered, "Miss Marple, these notes about the will, they could explain motive. Someone might have known about the changes." "Indeed," she said softly. "And knowledge of the will combined with the intruder's careful movements suggests intention. The murderer acted with foresight. The broken window, the footprints, the hurried correspondence, all indicate a deliberate plan, rather than a random act." Pike shivered. I didn't see anyone, Miss Marple. I only felt someone's presence. Watching. Waiting." Miss Marple's sharp eyes observed him closely. The slight tremor in his hands, the quick darting of his eyes, even the tone of his voice, all spoke volumes. He was truthful about his fear, but there were gaps in his recollection, omissions made not out of deceit, but instinctive caution. The human mind often conceals precisely what it feels safest to withhold. Her attention turned to the window once more. The narrow smear along the sill and the delicate footprints suggested a visitor light of step, perhaps smaller and more agile than Leonard. Someone practiced in moving without drawing attention. She noted the subtle tilt of the chair, the displacement of a small ornament, and the faint impressions on the carpet leading from the doorway to the desk. Each detail, when viewed together, formed a story of calculated intrusion. A faint whisper of perfume drifted into the room, delicate yet unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone had been here recently. Someone who left not only physical traces but subtle sensory hints of their passing. It was the kind of detail that would escape the ordinary observer, but spoke clearly to one attuned to human behavior. "Constable," she said quietly, "you must ensure that the staff and visitors are accounted for. Ask Miss Eleanor Hawthorne and Mr. Lionel Havers about their movements yesterday and today. And, Leonard, recount your actions again, slowly and precisely. Every step, every hesitation. There is meaning in what you remember and in what you do not." The shadows deepened further as the lamplight flickered across the study. Miss Marple folded her hands, allowing her thoughts to weave together the threads. The anxious letters, the altered ledger, the broken latch, the careful footprints, and the subtle scent left behind. Somewhere amid these careful traces lay the key to understanding not only Sir Geoffrey's death, but the intentions and fears of those around him. She allowed herself a quiet smile, as one might in the presence of a puzzle beginning to reveal its hidden design. The night was still, the manor hushed, but the game had begun, and Miss Marple, patient and observant, felt the pattern emerging, one small clue at a time, until the entire truth would inevitably be illuminated. Dawn crept slowly over Gull's Point Manor, painting the walls with a pale, watery light that revealed every shadow and every detail in sharper clarity than the previous night had allowed. Miss Marple moved quietly through the study, her eyes sweeping over the desk, the scattered letters, and the faint scuff marks on the polished floorboards. Each element told a story, and the early morning stillness allowed her to observe with uninterrupted focus. Leonard Pike entered hesitantly, carrying a tray with tea. His face was still pale, and the tremor in his hands betrayed the lingering tension from the previous night. "Miss Marple," he said softly, I tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about what happened. I just can't understand why anyone would—" "Shh," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "There is much that we do not yet know, Leonard, but patience and observation will reveal the truth." She gestured to the chair by the desk. "Sit. Tell me again, slowly, everything you remember from yesterday morning, every step you took, every door you opened, and every sound you heard." Pike nodded, swallowing hard, and began his recounting. Miss Marple listened intently, noting the subtle hesitations and repeated phrases. Every pause, every nervous glance toward the window added to the story he unwittingly revealed. The intruder's path, their purpose, their subtle manipulations, these were beginning to form a clearer picture. When he had finished, Miss Marple moved to the window, examining the broken latch and the faint smear along the sill. The careful, deliberate entry of the intruder, the footprints in the dust, and the tilt of the chair near the desk, all suggested someone accustomed to moving quietly, someone with precise intent. Her mind connected these details with the crumpled letter and the hastily altered ledger. "The person who came here," she murmured, almost to herself, "knew Sir Geoffrey's routines, understood his anxieties, and acted in a manner designed to leave fear rather than noise." She paused, considering the faint floral scent lingering in the air. And yet they left enough behind, inadvertently, to reveal themselves to one who pays attention. Constable Greenway entered, rubbing his eyes and carrying a notebook filled with observations. "Miss Marple, I've accounted for all the visitors and deliveries. Miss Eleanor Hawthorne and Mr. Lionel Havers were in their respective quarters last night. No one left or entered unnoticed, except perhaps this mysterious intruder." Miss Marple turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Indeed, and the intruder was cautious, deliberate, and small of step. They relied on the element of psychological tension, letting Leonard's fear guide our awareness of their presence." Greenway frowned. "So, someone wanted to frighten us, or at least leave us uncertain." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "And that uncertainty can be most revealing. Fear exposes hesitation, highlights omissions, and signals intentions. Leonard's observations, combined with the subtle disturbances in the study, show us that this was no accident. Sir Geoffrey did not simply fall. He was confronted by someone who had planned their visit and acted with care." Miss Marple picked up the crumpled letter again, turning it gently in her hands. The jagged, hurried handwriting spoke of urgency and concern. The content hinted at a meeting, a resolution of a matter that Sir Geoffrey had not anticipated could occur at that moment. The ledger and changes to the will suggested motive. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The intruder had known Sir Geoffrey intimately enough to understand his habits and vulnerabilities. She folded the letter carefully and looked toward Leonard Pike. "You have observed more than you realize, Leonard. Your fear, your hesitation, your recounting of events, all of these form part of the puzzle. And from them, we can begin to discern the person who would have had the knowledge, motive, and opportunity to act." The morning sun grew stronger, casting long shadows across the floor. Miss Marple's mind, as always, was assembling the pieces quietly, patiently. Somewhere within the careful movements, the altered documents, and the faint traces left behind, lay the identity of the one who had disrupted the manor with calculated subtlety, and she, as always, would follow those threads to their inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the fireplace, letting her eyes rest on the faint outline of the hearth and the slight tilt of the mantel ornaments. Every detail in the study had significance. Every subtle shift in position or texture hinted at human activity that had occurred before Leonard Pike had discovered Sir Geoffrey. She allowed herself a small inward smile. The puzzle was not yet complete, but the threads were beginning to interlace in a pattern only she could perceive. "Leonard," she said, turning to the caretaker, "tell me once more about the morning's events, particularly your movements from the moment you first heard something unusual upstairs." Every action, no matter how minor, could be important. Pike swallowed and recounted his path once again, this time slower, emphasizing the precise placement of his steps, the doors he had opened, and the exact sequence of sounds he had heard. Miss Marple noted the tiniest inconsistencies compared to his previous recounting, the hesitations, the glances, the slight tremor in his voice whenever he mentioned the window or the footsteps. People often revealed more by what they unconsciously omitted than by what they deliberately reported. Constable Greenway had resumed his examination of the ledger, flipping through the pages carefully. "Miss Marple," he said, "the will changes. They're subtle, but they do shift considerable sums. Someone might have known about them beforehand." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and knowledge can be as powerful as action." The intruder, or perhaps intruders, had insight into Sir Geoffrey's anxieties and the adjustments he had recently made. That insight guided their movements. Her attention returned to the window. The broken latch, the faint smear of dirt, and the footprints in the dust indicated someone careful, deliberate, and practiced in moving quietly. Miss Marple traced the pattern with her mind, noting the path from the window to the desk and then back toward the door. Every movement was purposeful, almost choreographed, yet small missteps, the smudge, the displacement of letters, the faint floral scent revealed the human presence behind the careful facade. "Constable, I would suggest we vary all visitors and deliveries once more," she said. "There is a pattern to what was expected and what was unanticipated. The person who arrived yesterday moved within that gap, knowing precisely how to exploit it." Greenway nodded, though he appeared slightly impatient. "And you're certain, Miss Marple, that this was deliberate?" "Absolutely," she replied. "An accident leaves chaos. A careful intruder leaves intention. And intention always reveals itself to one who observes, patiently." She returned to the desk, examining the crumpled letter again. The jagged handwriting, the anxious phrasing, and the mention of a secret meeting all suggested that Sir Geoffrey had anticipated an encounter. Someone had forced that encounter to a fatal conclusion, exploiting knowledge of his routine and the vulnerabilities he tried to conceal from others. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift to the subtle cues around the room. The slight tilt of the chair near the desk, the displaced ink blotter, the faint scuff marks on the floor leading toward the study door. Each indicated a careful orchestration, a movement designed to unsettle and to mislead, yet inadvertently leaving a trail for one who knew how to read it. The wind outside carried a faint, lingering perfume once more, delicate and persistent. Miss Marple's eyes twitched. She had noted this earlier. Someone had been present in the manor who left traces of themselves beyond the physical, small, almost imperceptible signatures that hinted at personality, intent, and habit. These were the details most overlooked, but they spoke loudly to one who observed. "Leonard, Constable," she said finally, folding her hands. "All these small observations point toward a person with precise knowledge, deliberate intent, and a careful hand. And the evidence, though subtle, is sufficient to determine their identity once we consider who had both motive and access. Soon, the pieces will fall into place." Miss Marple looked around the study one last time, her blue eyes sweeping over every detail, every smudge, every irregularity. The web of human intention, fear, and secrecy was intricate but not impenetrable. With patience and subtle reasoning, the truth was beginning to emerge, quietly but inevitably. Miss Marple stood quietly in the drawing room, her gaze resting on the assembled figures: Leonard Pike, Constable Greenway, Miss Eleanor Hawthorne, and Mr. Lionel Havers. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long beams across the polished floorboards, illuminating every subtle tension in the room. She allowed a moment's pause, letting the quiet swell until it became almost tangible, a silence heavy with anticipation. "My dear friends," she began softly, her voice calm but precise. "We have spent many anxious hours attempting to understand the events of yesterday, but the truth has been present all along in the small details overlooked by those too impatient or too frightened to notice them." She gestured toward the study. "Consider the broken window latch, the narrow smear on the sill, and the delicate footprints in the dust. They indicate a visitor small in stature, cautious in movement, someone who intended to enter and leave without notice. Yet the intruder was not entirely careful. The crumpled letter, the hastily altered ledger, the faint scent of perfume, all betray human presence. Even the smallest indiscretion can reveal the greatest secrets." Leonard Pike shifted uneasily, and Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unwavering, met his. "You saw fear yesterday, Leonard, not just in yourself, but in the intruder's careful attempts at concealment. That fear, combined with knowledge of Sir Geoffrey's habits and the subtle changes in his will, points us towards someone intimately familiar with both the household and the man." "Himself?" She turned then to Mr. Lionel Havers, who had been shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Havers, you called on Sir Geoffrey yesterday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss business matters. Yet the evidence shows that someone knew the precise timing and opportunity to confront Sir Geoffrey privately. The hastily crumpled letter suggests urgency. The note left hidden behind the hearth indicates secrecy. Someone intended a meeting, one that would leave no witnesses but would exploit Sir Geoffrey's vulnerabilities." Havers' face paled slightly, and Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but unwavering. "You see, Sir Geoffrey's death was not accidental, nor was it the result of a stranger's intrusion. It was a confrontation, deliberate and calculated, and only someone who knew him well could have anticipated his morning routine, his movements within the study, and the placement of his papers and belongings. The subtle indications, the scuff marks on the floor, the displaced chair, the crumpled letters, point unmistakably toward you." Havers' eyes widened, and he opened his mouth, but no words came. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though it remained unyielding. "The motive is clear when one considers the changes in Sir Geoffrey's will. Certain clauses redirected substantial legacies, causing fear and desperation in someone who had assumed entitlement, and the careful movements through the window, along the study floor, leaving just enough evidence for the observant, demonstrate a knowledge and precision only you could possess." Not a long pause filled the room as Havers' composure faltered, his hand trembling. He slumped in his chair, the mask of civility slipping. It was meant to be quick," he muttered. I didn't mean," Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Intent is not always forgiven because it was hurried or clandestine, Mr. Havers. Your knowledge, your opportunity, and your anxiety betrayed you in subtle ways that could not escape observation. Sir Geoffrey's death was the result of your deliberate confrontation, prompted by fear of loss and a desire to control the outcome." Constable Greenway stepped forward, though still slightly in disbelief, and placed a hand on Havers' arm. "You are under arrest, sir. You will have the opportunity to explain yourself in due course." Leonard Pike exhaled, visibly relieved, though still pale. Miss Marple's eyes softened for a moment as she regarded him. "And you, Leonard, observed carefully, listened patiently, and contributed without realizing it to the understanding of what occurred. Your fear was honest, and your perception invaluable." Miss Marple turned to the room, her expression composed. Human nature is subtle, intricate, and often deceptive. Yet even the most careful actions betray themselves through the smallest, quietest signs. Today, the threads have been drawn together. Justice will proceed, and the household may now begin to recover, though the memory of what has transpired will linger. And perhaps, in the quiet reflection of this morning, each of us may consider the importance of patience, observation, and the truths hidden in plain sight. The room remained silent, the weight of revelation settling over them. Outside, the wind carried the distant cry of gulls and the low rhythm of the waves against the shore, as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the unraveling of a carefully woven deception. Miss Marple stood calmly, the picture of composed wisdom, knowing that, as always, understanding human nature was the key to uncovering even the most carefully hidden truths.